Okay, welcome to everyone. I'm still admitting more and more people. We are up to, looks like about 35.
Great.
Hi, Dan. Hi, Tony.
Hi.
Rick.
Unmute. Start video.
There we go.
Okay.
Okay, I think I got it. Hey, John.
Hey, Mary.
Sorry, I've got a dog.
Dog's out, bud.
Welcome to everyone. My name is Christina Hartley, and I'm the Executive Director at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. And we have transitioned to online discussion groups. This is actually the third one that we've done. So we did the Year of the Woman discussion group in April. We've done our semicolon discussion group, and this is the second Year of the Woman discussion group that we will be doing tonight. So just a couple of housekeeping things. Because we do have a large group, make sure that you are on mute if you are not talking. So that will cut down on other noise, etc. Down at the bottom of your screen, well, it's the bottom of my screen, but there's a place to be able to mute yourself. You were muted on your way in, but keep it quiet unless you are talking. And then we're going to have kind of an introduction to the discussion, and then Dr. Getz and Dr. Renzi will take it over from there in terms of if you have, things to say and you can't get a leg in for some reason, you can either kind of wave your hand, or you can always, let's see, you can always type something in the group chat, and I will try to interject if you're not getting in there. So to get us started today, hang on. Okay, so to get us started today, and yes, somebody asked about recording, and that is okay. To get us started today, I'm going to introduce Diana Porter, who's going to give us kind of an introduction to the Cary sisters. Diana Porter is a retired Cincinnati public school teacher with a passion for local history. Much of her research focuses on stories of people speaking out against or acting to end injustice and challenging social norms. Diana is also on the board of the College Hill Historical Society, and she works with 4 other women historian citizens who have published 3 local history pamphlets and share much of their research at HamiltonAvenueRoadToFreedom.org. So I'm going to let her kick us off, and I do have some pictures that go along with her discussion to start with. So I will put those up on the screen as she's talking, and then after that we'll, kind of focus back on the timeline, etc. So Diana, please take it away.
Thank you. I don't know if you can see behind me, but Christina will put it up on the screen in a moment. There's a Stourbridge lithograph of College Hill in 1865. But now my screen is big and I can't see my script.
Uh-oh.
So now I'm sorry, but I have to figure that out. Here we go. Got it. Okay. I'd like to begin by thanking Ruth Wells, Betty Ann Smithy, and Ed Lloyd and the College Hill Historical Society for all they've done over the years to keep College Hill history and the history of the Carys alive. Betty Ann has written a book, A Little Piece of Paradise, College Hill, Ohio. It is online and searchable. And if you want to know more about College Hill history, I really encourage you to look that up and read it. The Cary family tree can be traced all the way back to Sir Thomas Cary, a cousin of Queen Elizabeth, and John Cary, who came to Plymouth in 1630. Successive generations in the New World were prominent citizens in both Connecticut and New Hampshire. Christopher Cary lost an eye as a child and was later crippled by a falling tree, yet still, at 16, he went on to fight in Canada in the Revolutionary War. With his land warrant as pay for his service, Christopher, like many other veterans, bought land in the West. Christopher was 40 years old, and he and his 20-year-old brother, William, left New Hampshire in 1803 to move to his land in what is now North College Hill. William worked on his older brother's farm, and soon their mother and more of their siblings followed, and a large extended Cary family began their lives in the West. Christopher's brother, William, married Rebecca Fenton, and they opened a tavern downtown. In 10 years, they made enough money to purchase 491 acres of land, build a cabin, and establish a sawmill along Hamilton Avenue. A small brick school was built, and their sons, Freeman and Samuel, were among the first students to attend for 3 or 4 months each fall and winter. Freeman went on to graduate from Miami University and returned to that same brick schoolhouse to begin his teaching career during the winter months of 1831. Among his students were Alice Cary, 11, and Phoebe Cary, 7, as well as many of his other Cary cousins. After only 1 year, Freeman Cary went on to open his own private boarding school for boys, which eventually grew into Farmers College, a liberal agricultural school and liberal arts school, which attracted abolitionist professors and many sons of abolitionists from the region, as well as prosperous young men from Kentucky and Louisiana. His brother Samuel became a congressman for Ohio and a national speaker against slavery and for temperance. And yes, Cary, North Carolina is named after Samuel Fenton Cary. Christopher and William, remember, were brothers. Christopher fought in the Revolutionary War, and he came to Cincinnati and had a son, Robert. His son, Robert, fought in the War of 1812, returned from war and married Elizabeth Jessup in 1813 and built a cabin in 1814 on Hamilton Avenue at Galbraith. It's actually where the Shell station is, in Galbraith and North Bend, if you know. not North Bend, Galbraith and Hamilton. It's diagonally across from the Cary Laboido Cemetery, which is still there, and where many Revolutionary War veterans, as well as Cary family members, are buried. In 1824, Robert bought a 60-acre farm a short distance north of that cabin. Alice named the farm Clovernook for the clover that grew in the fields, and that name lives on today as Clovernook Center for the Blind and Visually Impaired, which occupies half of the original 60-acre farm. It takes the large Robert Cary family 15 years of very hard work to pay off the debt incurred by buying this farm. Life is not easy, and there was little time left after the farm work was done. Phoebe later wrote about her mother that she was, quote, an exemplary housewife, a wise and kind mother. She left no duty unfulfilled, yet she found time, often at night, after every other member of the household was asleep, by reading to keep herself informed of all the issues of the day, political, social, and religious, end quote. When Alice was 12 and Phoebe 8, their father finished building a new 7-room brick home on the farm. It's now called Kerry Cottage, and it still exists on Hamilton Avenue and is a site with an Ohio marker, as you can see. Robert, Elizabeth, and their 7 children all moved to the new house. Their grandfather, Christopher, later came to live with them. The Cary home subscribed to the Cincinnati Sentinel, the Universalist newspaper, and the Sentinel was the very first to pay Alice for her poetry, a whole $10. Alice and Phoebe lived a simple, harmonious life. But in 1835, the cholera epidemic swept through Cincinnati and their mother died. Soon after, Robert remarries, this time to a frugal woman who does not want to see the girls waste their time by writing poetry. Robert wants to support his daughters, so he decides to build another house. And he moves the rest of the family, leaving the Cary sisters, Alice 15 and Phoebe 11, to live at Clovernook, separated from their new stepmother. Less than a mile from Clovernook is the Free Meeting House in Mount Healthy. It was built in 1825 and housed 2 religious congregations, the Presbyterians, they became New School Presbyterians, and the Universalists, whose circuit preachers would alternate weeks. Alice and Phoebe's family were Universalists and attended this meeting. The first meeting house in Mount Healthy was more than just a place of worship. The topic of ending slavery was debated and discussed there as the Presbyterians and Universalist congregations dealt with these issues, but also at the meeting of the new political party, the Liberty Party, founded by Gamaliel Bailey. William Cary, the great uncle of Phoebe and Alice, ran for office on the Liberty Party ticket in Hamilton County. But more than just the Liberty Party, you see the announcement here in the Philanthropist for the 1841 Hamilton County Anti-Slavery Convention. It was held there in the Free Meeting House. So clearly, Alice and Phoebe were surrounded by much discussion of the issues of the day. So it's not surprising then that Gamaliel Bailey would later continue to publish Alice's poetry when he became the editor in Washington, D.C. of the abolitionist publication, The New Era. The sisters never forgot their early life in the farming community. The reflections on their life, relationship to nature, their spirituality, and their family became the centerpiece of their poetry, prose, and hymns that are their legacy today.
Thank you, Diana, for providing that great introduction to the Cary family. So that's kind of how the Carys got to the Cincinnati area, specifically to College Hill, and how the Cary sisters began their writing careers. So we're going to transition, there's more people, sorry. So we're going to go ahead and transition into the discussion portion of tonight's our own meeting, so to speak. And I'm going to let Dr. Getz kind of take over from here. There is one more picture that he might want to talk about, if I can get it. There we go. So this is also a picture of the Kerry Cottage. John, do you want to talk about that just a little bit?
That's from the public library in Cincinnati, and it's described as a lantern slide and was taken or made in 1852. So that's the very year that Clovernook came out, the book. And it's a view of the house that is very, very timely with the period we're talking about.
Okay, great.
Diana, do you know anything else about this image?
Well, not the image itself, but the Kerry Cottage, when I first moved here, was open once a month, and there was a whole society that supported it. It was arranged with objects from the 1840s that were very period authentic, and it was a wonderful place to go and experience that history. Unfortunately, there was a flood, and they've lost all the generation of volunteers who gave all the tours. And so anyone who wants to encourage Clovernook to continue their support for the Kerry Cottage, they are trying to find ways to get it back open again, to get it furnished again. And I encourage people to, if they would be interested in being docents or in any way supporting that effort, to please contact Clovernook.
Okay, great. Should I put up the timeline?
Sure, I think we're ready for that.
Okay, so John always prepares a timeline for our discussions, which kind of gets us going with, how things are all connected in terms of how things are connected to Harriet and how things are connected to the readings for today. So let me put that up there.
There it is. And well, I'll do a very good introduction to this. So I'll come at it from the Harriet Beecher Stowe perspective here. She's born in Litchfield, Connecticut, a New Englander, born to the famous Presbyterian minister Lyman Beecher. This is old news to people who have been involved with Beecher Stowe House, but we have some newcomers tonight. So a key line in that first, or a key word in that first line is Presbyterian. Lyman Beecher was a famous Presbyterian preacher. So the religious orientation that Harriet grows up with is going to be significantly different from the one that the Cary sisters grow up with, starting when Alice was born in 1820. Her parents are Universalists. That's a much more, as the name might suggest, a broader religion, a fundamental belief that everybody is saved, which is almost the opposite of the Calvinist Presbyterian tradition. And the Universalists tended to be very involved with the cause of abolition. Truly, I believe, would merge with the Unitarians or some Unitarians to form the Unitarian Universalist Church. So Alice and Phoebe are born in the early 1820s. The year 1832, when Kerry Cottage opened, when Phoebe and Alice and other family members moved in there, is the very year that Harriet Beecher Stowe moved to Cincinnati, and would soon settle in Walnut Hills because of her father becoming president of Lane Theological Seminary there, and his house becomes the Harriet Beecher Stowe house that we know and love today, but can't get into right now because of the lockdown. Let's see what else Diana mentioned that the second wife of the Phoebe and Alice's father was not interested in their poetry or their reading or writing at all. There is a story that they would stay up late at night after everybody had gone to sleep and use a saucer with a rag in the middle filled with lard and create a makeshift candle so that they could read and write. Let's see, they start getting published. Diana talked about that. And they begin to achieve some literary fame by the late 1840s. They start getting published beyond the local circles. Their work is praised by famous people like Allan Poe, who was a notoriously tough critic, but he praised one of Alice's poems. And they struck up a relationship with Rufus Griswold, an editor and critic who helped them get their anthology published in 1848. Horace Greeley, the editor, the famous newspaper editor, actually liked their work and visited them in their Mount Healthy cottage in 1849. By 1850, Alice moves to New York to try to make her living as a writer. There's speculation about exactly why she did that, but certainly being a professional writer was one of her goals. She and her sister had started to get some fame. Their volume of poetry together with the two of them came out in 1850. And so she moves to New York and is joined the following year by her sister Phoebe. So they're both based in New York and established a kind of salon there in which many famous people came and hung out with them as they served tea on one night a week. So and that happens also in the 1850s in New York. And they had that's 1855 when they bought that. So guests included P.T. Barnum, Elizabeth Stoddard, Henry Ward Beecher, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among many others. They would serve, they turned it into their apartment or their house into a salon for tea and conversation one night a week. Skip back a bit just to 1852, which is the big year for Harriet Beecher Stowe, when Uncle Tom's Cabin comes out as a book and becomes the blockbuster that it became. The same year, Alice publishes Clovernook, or Recollections of Our Neighborhood in the West. And it certainly wasn't as big as Uncle Tom's Cabin, but it was a good selling book and attracted a lot of critical attention. Well, the two sisters, continue to publish. And through the 1850s and 60s. Scroll ahead to 1869, the last item there. Alice has become the first president of I never know how to pronounce this, Sorosis or Sorosis, the first organization for professional women, the first women's club. Alice was the first president of that in New York. And Susan, here's another connection with Harriet at the end. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton had been trying unsuccessfully to recruit both Harriet and her half-sister Isabella Beecher Hooker to write for and even edit their weekly feminist newspaper, The Revolution, for which Phoebe even worked part of the time. Well, the Beecher sisters were a little reluctant to write for a periodical called The Revolution, and they suggested to Elizabeth Cady Stanton that they change the name. She didn't like that. She really wanted a revolution. She said, well, maybe you'd like us to call this periodical The Rosebud. We're not interested in that kind of publication, so we want to stick with The Revolution. Well, Alice and Phoebe Cary were happy to contribute to The Revolution. And in fact, Alice had been trying for a little while to get them to take a novel she was working on called The Born Thrall, or Woman's Life and Experience. But unfortunately, her health declined once the Stanton accepted it and said that this was going to be what Uncle Tom's Cabin was to the anti-slavery movement. This work will be to the cause of women. Sadly, she couldn't finish it before she got sick and died. And both of the sisters died within a few months of each other in 1871. So, Diana, is there anything you'd like to add to that timeline?
There was a third sister who lived there, Emmeline, who was also sickly, and all three of them are buried in Brooklyn in the Greenwood Cemetery. And I guess I've seen a picture of the gate. It says Cary there, so it's sort of nice. It makes me want to visit. But no, I was unaware of the serialized novel that Alice had proposed. That's great.
Well, let's get into the discussion of the works that people read for tonight. And I think Kristen is going to get us started with that.
Hi, all. Thank you for being here. And really, I think we're open to starting wherever folks would like to begin. We had a short story and then a collection of poems. And so I don't know if there's a place where you all would like to focus our conversation to begin with. Was there any, we have votes for poetry, votes for prose? Guess it's kind of hard to chime in if we're all muted, right? So, we can go ahead and start with the odd man out.
I have a couple people who said poetry.
Oh, okay,
in the
perfect.
chat, but
Then let's start. With the poetry. So, what do you guys make of this interesting mix of poems? One of the questions that was most striking to me as I was looking at them was about the kind of tone of the variety of poems. Some are very serious, some are very tongue-in-cheek. They're clearly invested in many issues, women's issues, but other issues as well. So I guess, how do they strike you? Are these hopeful poems? John's just told you they were happy to join the revolution. Do you see seeds of that in the poetry, that we can move beyond some of these issues in the 19th century, or are they pessimistic about the future? Do they have a kind of sense of skepticism about humans and the project?
I'll speak up. I liked Phoebe's poetry. And it was positive and, obviously very centered on female rights. And I loved the one where she talks to, the henpecked husband. I thought that was so, it had humor in it, but she was really presenting an issue. And the other one, when she talks to women about how they present themselves when they're, trying to make political statements and vote and all this, I thought was great, because she was basically saying, don't use your feminine wiles, speak honestly and truthfully. I love those. Personally, I did not care for Alice's poetry as much. I liked her prose.
Okay, great. Thank you.
We have a question in the chat from Rachel. Rachel, do you want to ask the question or should I read it? You'll have to unmute.
Sorry, 1 second.
Great.
My computer's not working, so I'm going off the screen of my computer and the sound of my phone. I mean, so I'm here with some friends, and a couple of us were struck. We were talking before this about stuff, about the poems that we had read, and as a sister myself, I'm struck by the relationship between the sisters, their differences. I'm curious about their dynamic, and I was struck by, like, Phoebe. I just going off the poetry alone that was selected, I assumed I wouldn't have assumed that Alice was necessarily the more prominent writer, and I got the sense from Phoebe's writing that there was something bolder and like more impassioned in her politics. And just reading the John Brown work, especially considering the controversial nature of him, I was just curious if they had differences politically, and if this is just coming through in the selection that of poems for tonight, and if they had different stances towards like thinking about their relationship to women's rights versus their relationship to abolition. So how was their were they allies? Was their allyship, like, did it involve a different tone than their advocacy for their own rights as women?
Yeah, I think the answer to that in general is that Phoebe was much more politically active and much more political in her poetry than Alice. I don't think they disagreed. It's just that Alice was more shy, more diffident about her politics and about her ideas, whereas Phoebe was more, much more willing to speak out and to bring the politics into the poetry more.
Which may, in fact, explain in some measure why she was the less prominent poet.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about the kind of norms around poetry versus political writing, we tend to think about political writing as less literary often, right? It veers into the propaganda territory. And so, I mean, I think her poems are quite literary, but of the 4 poems we read by Phoebe, 2 seem invested in abolition, 2 seem invested in women's rights, whereas Alice's poems, the 2 that we read, seem very invested in kind of moving from a romantic to a realist mode, but those are much less, I think, divisive issues. And there is a kind of veneer of nice stuff.
Alice was the more popular poet and wrote a lot more, and she's the only one of the 2 who wrote fiction as well. But Phoebe wrote a number of hymns that I think some of them still show up in hymnals today. And Alice from too, I think. But it's more a difference of temperament. The one reason Alice was more prolific as a writer is that Phoebe spent a fair amount of her time sort of running the household and taking care of Alice, doing some of the things that freed Alice's time to write more.
So Phoebe was the
Joetta asked if you have the names of the hymns. I guess there's some interest in knowing what those are.
Oh, okay.
Diana does.
Okay, well, go ahead, Diana.
This was in a Unitarian book that I found, One Sweetly Solemn Thought. Don't know if you know it, but it's been republished in a group of Unitarian hymns.
Can you say that again? I didn't quite catch it.
One sweetly solemn thought. One sweetly solemn thought comes to me o'er and o'er, nearer my home today. I am then ere I've been before. Amen.
And that's Phoebe, right?
This is
Would we like to look at one of the particular poems? We can look at I mean, it kind of seems like there's like three groupings of poems if I group them loosely. Harvest Gathering and John Brown sort of seem to go together. Was He Henpecked and Free Advice to Certain Women seem to go together, and then To Solitude and the West Country sort of seem to go together. So are there any of those pairings that seem most interesting to folks?
Well, from the Harriet Beecher Stowe perspective, I would be most interested in the John Brown and
Harvest Gathering?
Harvest poem, yes. So we could start there, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's maybe start with the Harvest Gathering, because I think this is one that's tricky, a little bit sly in its approach. When do you start to realize that this is a critique of slavery?
Not till at least halfway through.
Right.
At first it's just, it's the last days of summer and it's all, the harvest is going, and then, but then there's the oppression that goes along with the harvest. Don't forget about that.
Yeah. What do you, like, why, I guess, what do you make of that decision to delay that kind of, but also these are all the things to think about? I mean, and I think about this today, right? We could have the exact same conversation around who is actually growing the food that we eat? What are the conditions under which they work? Why wait until we're midway through the poem to raise that key question of oppression?
I personally thought it was to really capture the attention, because it comes out of nowhere, and all of a sudden you're really listening to, seeing the poem in a different light.
So it's like a 180 shift for us, right?
Yes.
We're looking at all this autumnal beauty, and then we suddenly move to this other space of critique.
Yes.
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think it's to me, it's a very effective move to undercut my ho-hum dawdling going along, looking at the romanticism of fall, to be like, oh, wait, I got to think about some stuff here.
Well, she may have also done it because she could capture different readers at first, because, again, it was more written like the time, the romanticism, or the, what it was, the beauty of fall, and maybe get her message across to different people, because she did insert it in the middle.
Right, it doesn't broadcast itself. I'm a political poem, right? It gets you into the poem before adding that critique element, and as such, may surprise a casual reader.
And by yoking the two of them together, it suggests that the second half of the poem is just the underside of the first half, that there is a connection between the lovely pastoral scene in the North and how great everything seems there, and then the slavery in the South. They're not two different things. They're two halves of the same American coin at that time. Mm-hmm. It's a kind of fall into experience in the second half of the poem. It's a harvest time, it's the fall, but it's another kind of fall too.
It reminds me a little bit about of Emily Dickinson, who used those Protestant hymn tune forms and just exploded them from within. And also she often had a second stanza that turned the first one upside down. So it's kind of similar to Dickinson's technique from that point of view. Mm-hmm.
So if we look at
in this last stanza.
So I was going to say, if we look at some of the things that are going on in the chat, I'm trying to multitask here. So we're looking at some of the things that are going on in the chat, that many are enjoying the fruits of labor, and then all of a sudden there's a 180 shift. And then it's like a kind of a creeping implication of white society embedding slavery. There was a question about what year it was published and how that relates to the Missouri-Kansas dispute.
Yeah,
Do I know what year it was published?
publication date is 1850.
Okay, so a little bit before Missouri-Kansas, because that was 54.
Yes, but by 1850, what was the big controversy? If you look in the second last stanza, they who would see that growth of wickedness planted where now the peaceful prairie and make the green paths of our wilderness red with the torn and bleeding feet of slaves, forbid it, heaven, and let the sharp axe be laid at the root of that most poisoned tree. A little echo of William Blake there, but what's she talking about here in this stanza? What's going on in the late 1840s?
1850 compromise. Right.
Leading up to the 1850 compromise, exactly. And one of the aspects of that was trying to figure out what to do with the newly acquired land from the war between the US and Mexico. How much of that was going to be allowed to be slave territory? And that's how in the Compromise of 1850, California gets in as a free state and other things happen there. But I think what she's worried about here is indeed what would happen in Kansas and Nebraska in the 1850s, taking some also lands acquired in the Mexican War, turning those into slave states, which was very much the agenda of the slaveholding South at that point. So she's saying, keep your hands off our prairie land.
And it is the year of the Fugitive Slave Act too. I see that in the comments. Yeah, September of that year is Fugitive Slave Act. So the discrepancy, and you see in the let's see, it's the fourth. Wait, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth stanza. The appeal to religion and hypocrisy here, right? God of the seasons, thou who didst ordain bread for the eater who shall plant the soil. How have they heard thee who have forged the chain and built the dungeon for the sons of toil? That's a really clear indictment through a religious lens of, I don't know if it's, I mean, it is white folks here, but it's about particularly a religious sector of white folks, right, who are not eating this rule, bread for the eater who shall plant the soil. They're instead doing something else completely, right? They're building a dungeon. So there's a really clear reach and critique of a particular sector of white folks.
And another metaphor that runs through the second half of the poem is cutting down the poison tree, cutting down slavery. That metaphor that contrasts with the harvest in the first half of the poem, a kind of benign, pleasant harvest of good labor and good things planted. Now we have to cut down something else, and that's slavery. So she really turns the whole poem upside down in the second half, which is a terrific move, I think, on her part.
Any other comments that people want to raise about harvest gathering?
Where were these poems published?
They publish all sorts of different places. Sometimes they're in their own collections. And I haven't been able to track down the publication site of all of them, but they did publish a number of collections in their lifetime. And the first one was together with the two of them, but then they started publishing separate volumes. So it could have been some of their poems were in those collections. Others were published in periodicals, like the John Brown, which was published in that's the Greenfield, Massachusetts Gazette. So kind of wherever they could publish them, really. And I'm not sure that the henpecked, was he henpecked? was published in her lifetime or not. The first use of it I could find was in a book that was published by one of their friends after they had died. So I could be wrong about that. I haven't been able to track down if it was published before that.
I think I saw a question, or maybe I think it was a question. Yeah. Dan, do you consider this short story to be feminist literature? That's an interesting question to me. But we could also ask that about, obviously, some of the poems. There's also a question in the group chat, or a request, I guess, to talk about the West and what that is. Cincinnati being part of the West. Is this a romanticized space for Alice? So anyone on either of those branches?
Well, I think it was unusual for women to publish anyway, so they had to be almost feminist.
I mean, certainly, was he henpecked? Seems very clearly to outline and work through a long dialogue between husband and wife, right? And ultimately, the resolution of this long conversation is what? What is the husband's real problem, according to Mrs. Dorking? Our second to last stanza of this poem says, starting slightly before.
Basically the husband is afraid that she's going to overshadow him too much. Afraid that she's going to, if she's out in the world and she's, becoming important in society, then she won't be the stay-at-home wife who just is demure to him anymore.
Right. All of these different objections. Why? You don't need to do this. I want you here. You're doing great work here. It ends up being about a concern of her roosting higher, right? That she is somehow going to lord over him. And this is unacceptable. So arbitrary, too. Like, I mean, if you think about a bunch of chickens roosting in a hen house, I'm not sure that one roosting higher or lower has a distinct advantage, right? They're all under the same roof. But this is very, very concerning to him. I do think that is a feminist observation, right? To say that ultimately much of this discourse and questions comes down to a fear of being inferior in some way or of losing one's position. Do you see similar thoughts or ideas or questions raised in the short story, which is a very strange short story and not at all explicit in any way?
I thought the short story was more, well, it was a little suspenseful. I mean, I don't know what she was attempting for. It became clear as it went on who the child was and who the man was. But maybe it was an attempt at suspense. I don't know that it didn't seem as feminist as what Phoebe writes. So I didn't get the impression that it was intended to be feminist, but more of just fiction and about ghosts and what happens and relationships. So a little different than Phoebe to me.
I found the sexual tension. She was always going over to see the people and looking for the boy. Did anybody else see that, or was I just perverted at the time?
No, I think she's hoping to see him, and he's usually not there when she's looking for him.
And she doesn't pay any attention. He doesn't pay any attention to her.
I think that's a key point in the story, paying attention to who pays attention to whom, and why and when is attention paid to anybody in that story?
Can I add something? It seemed to me that she had this tone of quaintness in sort of describing the conditions of life there. And I just wondered if it was for a city audience who, got some kind of pleasant comfort out of reading about these quaint pastoral lives and the simplicity of the people who were depicted. Maybe, or, a good entertaining read before bed with the little bit of ghosts added in. But that's where I was curious about this whole notion of the West. I did some reading of a bunch of letters that were written back and forth between a family who came to Mount Healthy in the 1830s to their families back in Connecticut. And at one point, the man who was writing, Charles Cheney's, described the how healthful it was to be out in this sort of country rural life where he was having a farm. And I think maybe there was just a whole big image of this sort of new kind of life that people could have out west. And for those who couldn't go out west, maybe they just were entertained by reading about it.
Yeah, I think that's, I think she's writing, most of her readers are going to be in the East rather than in the Midwest. And they want to hear about what's going on out in the West. And of course, Ohio was the West in those days, part of it. But would it make you want to live there? In the poem, The West Country, or in the Wildermings? So if you were in the East reading this, would you want to pack up and head west? Let's move to Mount Healthy, Ohio?
I think it was the 19th century version of Petticoat Junction or something.
How the rural folk live, right?
Certainly the West Country emphasizes the hardness of this life, right? To some degree. It's great to romanticize farming or whatever, but this is a hard life and people working hard. This story strikes me as a little bit differently in the sense of, I agree with you that there is a kind of voyeurism of looking at what is the West like, but our narrator is also a voyeur, right? Our narrator is somebody who is, one, telling us about a family that's just moved in, that she's interested in looking at and figuring out what's going on. So it's almost a story where we're actually hearing a story about more outsiders rather than getting an inside look at the West, right? We're hearing a story about newcomers there, people who come, stay for a while, the girl dies, and they leave. So we have these various levels of remove from even being able to engage and see. Everything is overseen or heard. There's very few actual intimate connections between people. Even the strange scene where our narrator basically is there and sees the man that we presume is the father weeping over his child is one that very quickly, she doesn't say anything to him. There's no words of comfort exchanged. So to me, it's really hard to imagine what it would be like to live there. It seems like a very cold place. I don't know who my neighbors are. They're just looking at me. It seems a lot like the suburbs in some ways.
Can I get a copy of the poems?
West Country?
Yeah.
So all of the poems are, actually all of the readings are linked on our website. So if you go to stowehousecincy.org and then go to the tab that says Join the Discussion and Year of the Woman, then they're all linked on that particular website.
What's the name of it again?
It's stowehousecincy.org. And then you go to where it says Join the Discussion tab and Year of the Woman. since that's the name of our discussion series.
I just put the link in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, what do you all think about, first of all, why is this story called The Wildermings? Does that give away its secret?
Well, it's the people buried up on the hill, right? It's the young girl and then the mystery woman. Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think.
Mary Wilbur.
Yeah, that's right. Mary Wilderming. And
then the girl who dies is buried next to her.
Which I thought, when I read it, I almost thought that by the time I got through Solitude, the poem, I was thinking that the young girl who died was actually Alice Cary. She speaks a lot into Solitude, just about like the long, blind struggle, being alive, and I think it's dimly dying hopes that quite all die. Is that what hopes that quite never die? I'm sorry, I'm reading it. But I just got the impression that the girl with the eyes that never close, there's something there in Alice Cary.
Mm-hmm. Or the narrator, at least.
Right. Yeah, that's a good way to probably distinguish, you know.
Who's watching this family that's moved into the neighborhood.
Right.
But never quite finds out the story she wants to hear about Mary Wilmerdings, who dies.
Yes.
She wanted to hear that story about her death scene. She never got that.
Yeah.
She never really interacts with them in any meaningful way.
No, and it's so much. Of course, I only read a few poems here, 3 poems, but there just seems to be an attitude of just, gosh, you work hard, and hopefully we'll have good things to come when we die. But we get through this thing somehow. It's just it's a really kind of almost a bleak, but there is hope in it somewhere.
Well, remember, there were 9 children, 2 of them passed. And so they mourned that a long time. And yes. Their cabin, before they moved into the brick house, was diagonally across from the cemetery.
Oh.
Where all the Cary family, the Laboito family, and then the Revolutionary War veterans who had come to the hill were all buried.
Yes.
So she had to walk by that often. So.
Right. No, I mean, I get really good details, and you really get a good sense of place. The descriptions are just beautiful.
There's this really interesting aside at the beginning of this short story, which I find very curious, right? We start the story, and she's telling us, this is where these new people are living. And then we get the apropos of this. Let me tell you about this tree. And I really was really annoyed with this tree because it was so big and it was terrible, overshadowing all the other trees. I just wanted it to be out of there. And then they decided to cut it down, and it was a tragedy, and I missed it immediately. I missed it as they were cutting it down. And the moral, right? She sort of says, if I could see it standing once more, just once more, but I could not until this day. I feel a regretful pang when I think of that grand old tree. But the new neighbors. Okay. So what is this section supposed to be about? What are we learning in this passage? And how does this relate to the rest of the story? Right before we get to the apropos of this section, she gives us this meta commentary. We are likely to underestimate persons and things we have continually about us. But let separation come and we learn what they were to us.
I get a sense as I read it, and particularly when she jumped into the oak tree passage, it was almost like stream of consciousness writing, even though that genre didn't come about until much later. But it just seemed like she was talking about whatever popped into her head next. But I do see that something overshadows her, something that I didn't find anything about all the other people in the story. It seemed like the only person I know is the narrator. She was on her emotions, her feelings, and so forth, and whatever these other people caused her to feel. I didn't feel like that I got to know any of the other people. I only know the narrator.
And why would that be? I mean, why do you think Kerry would write a story like that?
Well, again, I think that there certainly is some loneliness to her life. There is certainly some feelings that she's not appreciated for who she is. That, you know, other people take precedence over her. Other people's stories are more interesting than her own story.
Maybe also about ways in which, I mean, the story about the oak tree is also about how we don't know or value the things around us until they leave us, right? And so I think there's a kind of commentary on the way in which we interact with our most immediate surroundings. If we have this idea that a small town is this intimate space where people are good friends and everybody knows what's going on with other people, this story might challenge that perspective, right? As you're saying, Sandra, we don't get to know anyone else in this small town. We don't get a sense that our narrator has a intimate community of friends. She's very interested in these strangers who may or may not be strange, but ultimately doesn't build any relationships. Maybe small towns are just as lonely as big cities.
I got the feeling that she lived on the outskirts, so she didn't have any near neighbors. And she was looking forward to having neighbors, but I also got the feeling that there was something unreal about the neighbors, and that it had to do with the ghost story. And I don't know, it felt very unreal, and either it was because she couldn't see them as real, or because they weren't, and that the whole thing is a ghost story. The ghost of the tree, maybe.
No, I think that's great. I mean, certainly we're asked to even think about the young girl briefly before she dies. We're given to know she's going to die. So, I mean, we do have this strange space where how are you supposed to build a relationship with somebody you know is transient, right? That seems to be a question that this story asks.
Yeah, there's that fragmentary, transitory quality about the whole story, I think. And I want to come back to what the person just said about the ghosts, or that it's a ghost story, and so, and it is in some ways. But I think a lot of times writers use ghost stories as a way of trying to get at a deeper truth. You don't have to believe in ghosts to necessarily understand what a ghost story might be about. And I think what are the two ghosts we hear about? There's Mary, the girl who died, and then there's another ghost in the town who they think they see, this John Hine, a wild roving fellow who never did any real harm in his life to anyone but himself. hastening his own death by foolish excesses. Now, he supposedly is seen in the graveyard sometimes over his grave. And then there's Mary Wilmerdings, who is seen as a ghost. So what would those two have in common? If they're the two possible ghosts we see in the story, what do those two people have in common?
Could Mary actually be the mother of the girl, and the man maybe have gotten her pregnant?
I think that's a very strong possibility in the story.
And that's why the ghost story means so much. And also, Alice's mother had died, and so she knew how it felt to not have a mother, and she was putting part of that in there.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds like that the man who wasn't very nice might have impregnated the lady, and then she died in childbirth, and then somebody else in the family, other people in the family took the child away, but came back when she was dying.
Okay, so you think that the guy that the narrator is attracted to is maybe like a brother or somebody, rather than the father of the.
Yeah, he could be the brother or the father. I mean, he was at a distance, and she never really saw him very well, and he cared for the girl, obviously. So it could have been a brother, a father. It more than likely was the father rather than the brother. And again, the girl was very young, but I don't know. I mean,
Yep.
It could have been anybody at this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's vague. We're left to put together implications, but I think with the title, The Wildermings as a family, and we have Mary, who is more sinned against than sinning. We hear like story about somebody coming too late, and then we have, a young girl and a man, and the girl's buried. I think we might reasonably put them together as a family, a tragic family. If we look at the way in which Mary Wildermings is described, though, it's as somebody who basically, a fair girl who is more sinned against than sinning, seems to indicate that there's some story about her that's not quite right, right? And we get a similar sort of feeling with John, too. John's a wild, roving fellow who never did any real harm in his life to anyone but himself, right? Both of these characters have been mischaracterized, right? There's something that's gone wrong in the way in which we've thought about them that our narrator's trying to write. If I had to pick something that connects them, that's what I would focus on.
They're outcasts of the town. They violated propriety somehow. And the narrator is identifying with them to some extent, I think, because she seems such a loner herself.
We are just past 8 o'clock, so I'm not trying to run anyone off yet, but we're going to be, excuse me, wrapping up in just a few minutes. Rachel, you had an interesting kind of question, comment, if you wanted to share that. And then I have one more afterwards. Rachel?
Oh, I was curious about whether, I guess the poignant quality of the story in part had to do with her own, like, I mean, is there some sense of like loss or a ghost of women's potential, or this young girl, like this, childbirth, that whatever happened, like whatever sins were done against her, and also the feeling of loss associated with like the demands and choices involved in supporting herself as a writer. I just had read something that on one side that I read about Alice Cary was that something about how the quality of her writing, the critical acclaim declined as she had to, be more prolific to support herself and her sister. So I was just struck, like, I don't know if she wished she had children, but there were like choices involved in the path that she took and constraints. And I was just like, reflecting on whether the tone or like a certain wistfulness could have been like infused into the writing itself.
I think that tone is certainly there in the story, a sense of wistfulness, a sense of life sort of passing you by in some ways. And think about what it would have been like to be living in Mount Healthy at this time when it was undergoing a lot of transformation. And some people passed through probably on their way further west, but also people a generation or two back were making their farms out of the wilderness. And then it's gradually on its way to becoming a suburb of Cincinnati. So there's a shifting identity, I think, even for the neighborhood at that point. And then she moves to New York. Like so many writers, it seems like they have to get away from the place where they were born in order to write about it. And there's both a celebration, or a good memory about it, some nostalgia, but also a sense that it wasn't perfect at all. It was hard work. There was a lot of isolation, a lot of weariness and loneliness about living there. And maybe some of that continues in New York, despite all the people who come to your salon. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but.
Yeah, thank you, yes.
I think the narrator in the Wilmerdings is also, in one sense, a Wilmerding. So there's a part of her that's sort of dead, buried in the graveyard too, not literally, but there, and maybe this adds to or is another part of the answer to your question, Rachel, that somehow there is this sense of loss, this sense of because when she sits in or very near the cemetery at one point, it's almost as if she blends into the scene so much that, the moths land in her lap and the moles are crawling all around. And it's almost as if she's been buried somehow in this town that might seem like a great place to live at first glance. And if you read some of the PR coming out of Cincinnati at the time, it might have sounded really good, but maybe it's not so great. She reminds me of some of those border figures in Wordsworth's poetry who are so at one with nature that they almost seem dead or partly dead. Well, we don't want to end on that note. That's too gloomy.
All right. There are a couple of other kind of questions, comments in the chat that kind of go along with that in terms of, this kind of storytelling seems rather self-conscious. And I like that the tree is a great representation of the shift from the old world to a new one. That's kind of an interesting way to look at it as well. And Edgar Allan Poe liked her work. Okay. All right. We are coming up on after 8, and I do want to be kind of respectful that everyone has given a lot of great comments and questions and so forth. I just want to kind of wrap up with a few other kind of things. Again, thank you for joining us. This is the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, and we are still learning how to transition from in-person discussions to an online format. Sometimes we do a little bit better job than others, but I do want to thank you for coming to join us tonight. I want to thank our scholars, Diana Porter, as well as Dr. John Getz and Dr. Kristen Renzi, both from Xavier University. And let you know that we will also be posting a recording of the discussion on our YouTube channel. So if you have, kind of want to go back and listen to anything or et cetera, or if you have additional questions or comments, you can always email us here and I will make sure that they get back to the right people. Our next event that we have coming up in terms of an online discussion is our Semicolon Club, which will be probably online. It is June 27th at noon. We will be discussing that's a Saturday, We will be discussing a book called We Are Your Sisters. And again, you can find that information on our website. And then we take a hiatus from this discussion series during the summer. So our next Year of the Woman discussion series will be Wednesday, September 7th at 7 p.m. And that's called Schools Open. So perhaps it will be open by then. We don't know. Again, at the Harriet Beecher Stowe House, we have been closed to the public since March 14th, but we have transitioned a lot of our things to online, including our discussion series. So we're still kind of learning how that works. Unfortunately, I was not able to give you Harriet's coffee blend tonight. But we've taken some of the money that we would have spent on snacks and have beefed up our Zoom so that we don't have a cutoff time on Zoom anymore. So, you know, we just had to transition how to do things in this new potential world. We do not know when the Harriet Beecher Stowe House will be open to the public again. We're waiting on orders from the governor and kind of direction from the Ohio History Connection to see when we will be able to do that. And even then, it's going to be limited numbers at first. So I anticipate continuing the online discussion series for the time being. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. Is there any big questions or comments before we go? No, I don't see anything. Well, again, thank you very much. I appreciate the camaraderie and the discussion, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks for a great discussion, everybody.
Thank you for doing this. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.